Good afternoon, and welcome to our Healthcare Executive Webcast series. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Pre-Election Political Point-Counterpoint with Donna Brazile and Newt Gingrich, moderated by Susan Dentzer. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key.
Today's webcast is eligible for 1.5 CPE credits. For the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy, to qualify for these credits, you must attend for a minimum of 75 minutes and respond to at least 5 of the 6 polling questions. The presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances. With that, I will turn it over to Brian Connor, Partner and National Practice Leader for Hospitals at Moss Adams. Brian?
Great, thank you, Amy. And welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining our Moss Adams 2020 Healthcare Executive Webcast series, Consequences of a Crisis and Revolutionizing. This is the 5th webcast in our series, so thank you to those that have joined previously. This is not the last session in our series, but this event each year feels like a pinnacle to the conference, and this year is certainly no different. On the eve of yet another historic election, we are excited to bring you our long-anticipated political point-counterpoint with our featured and renowned guests, Donna Brazile, Newt Gingrich, Susan Dentzer, who are quite literally battling a global pandemic and severe weather events, which may or may not be the result of climate change, to be with us here today. Although we cannot see you, we do welcome your participation and encourage you to submit questions throughout the session. We'll do our best to introduce those questions into the discussion. Your participation is critical to helping us deliver an engaging and thought-provoking virtual conference. Let's do a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Be sure to download our Moss Adams Conference Series app to connect with your peers today and throughout the series. A link to the app is available on the On24 console, and this app gives you the entire conference program at your fingertips and helps you network with other attendees. The link can also be found in your event registration emails from Moss Adams. As with each of our webcasts, this will be recorded and available for registrants on demand after the event. We'd certainly like to extend a special thank you to our sponsors who are helping us underwrite this event. Our premier sponsor, Shepherd Mullen and Arthur J. Gallagher, benefactor sponsor, Foley and Lardner, and our supporting sponsor, Cascadia Capital. So before we get started here, we do want to knock out a couple of polling questions. As mentioned, these are required for your CPE. And the first one we have is, what type of organization do you represent? Payer or health plan, physician medical group, hospital or health system, ancillary provider, or long-term care provider? I'll give you a few moments to respond. Participate, please click the button next to the answer you choose, and remember to hit Submit. And I'll give just a few more minutes. We've got about half the attendees here responding. I will expect as this presentation goes along that you will be quicker, audience, to get these polls submitted. And let's take a look at the answers here. So we've got a pretty broad spectrum of the healthcare industry represented, which is consistent with what we've seen throughout our other sessions this year and really throughout the years. And let's look at just one more. This is the $100 question here. Who do you predict will win the presidential election? We have answers available to you in the various parties here. And again, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 5 of the 6 polling questions. That will be introduced throughout the program. In our unofficial Gallup poll here, we have the Democratic Party with a slight majority here. So now I would like to introduce Eric Klein, who's the national team leader for the healthcare team and a partner at Shepherd Mullen, which is an AmLaw Global 100 full-service law firm, to introduce our esteemed guests who likely need no introduction and to make a few opening remarks. Eric?
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you to Moss Adams for allowing us to sponsor and to join you today. We love working with Moss Adams, one of the best accounting, tax, and consulting firms out there. And we work with them on many transactions, many projects. Today is an interesting time for us to have this conference here. And we're very pleased to have the panel with us. That's because of where we stand. As the national leader of the 170 plus attorney Shepherd Mullen healthcare team, we see a lot of what's going on out there right now in the world of healthcare. And clearly, healthcare is the spotlight issue for the election, whether it's because of COVID, which everybody unfortunately is very familiar with, because of the ACA and the upcoming Supreme Court decision on the ACA and its constitutionality, or because of the things that many of you in the audience and I are seeing, where we're seeing a significant trend of consolidation faster than ever before with physician groups and hospitals being purchased, many changes going on, where we're seeing many hospitals approaching bankruptcy or having problems. Many of the largest hospital systems are contemplating mergers and giving up independence or going to new configurations because of the healthcare environment, COVID, and the political uncertainty. And we're also seeing the start of further acceleration of the trend that we've been very much involved with as a law firm, which is the move from traditional fee-for-service to value and risk-based contracting. That has tremendously accelerated during the COVID crisis because the groups that are taking capitation and risk are actually still getting paid or doing quite well, whereas where we saw the groups that are getting paid fee-for-service see drop-offs to 79 to 90% utilization and barely struggling to survive. So very interesting times right now, and the election will really tell us what's going to happen for the future, what's going to happen with reimbursement rates, what's going to happen with Medicaid, which is expanding to cover more and more Americans today. 1 out of every 2 babies in the country on average are being born with Medicaid financing currently. So our panel today is going to give us quite an interesting perspective on the election, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Although I do have to say that last year's panel, when we were at the Moss Adams Healthcare Conference last year, was quite entertaining, where Susan Dentzer, our moderator today, who's moderating as well. Carl Rove actually got so annoyed at James Carville's interpretations of the political situation that he picked up one of our giveaways, a little Nerf ball that looked like the globe, and threw it at James Carville at one point, which was quite a highlight for many of us in the audience. I don't anticipate that today, mostly because we're virtual and also because Donna Brazile and Newt Gingrich are so much better behaved than either Carl or James. But with that being said, let me first introduce our moderator today, Susan Dentzer. Susan is a senior policy fellow at the Duke Margolis, the Center for Health Policy, which is affiliated with Duke University, one of the leading policy institutions in the country. And Susan has a very distinguished history. She's been really one of the thought leaders in health policy and health-related issues for many, many years, and is a frequent commentator and author, and also is very familiar to many of us who attend conferences in the healthcare industry, always adding value as a panelist or as a moderator. Donna Brazile, who joins us today, is a former chair of the Democratic National Committee and has had the distinction of being involved in every single presidential election campaign for many, many years. I think since the 1970s, if I recall correctly, although I don't want to actually go ahead. No, wrong. 1980s, perhaps. Your biography says 1976, but you look much too young for that.
No,
so,
I was a youth coordinator for Jimmy Carter.
There we go. So Donna also was the first African-American woman to serve as the manager of a major party presidential campaign, that of Vice President Al Gore. So we're very pleased to have Donna here with us today. And she is joined today by former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich is one of the renowned architects of the Republican Party's strategy over the years, and was the author, if you will, of the strategy that allowed the Republican Party to take control of the House of Representatives back in the 1990s. He also is a frequent speaker, author, and teacher as well. I've had the pleasure of reading some of Newt's books and have enjoyed them. But the thing that surprised me the most, actually, is that there's actually commonality between the two of them that I didn't expect. Both of them are actually contributors or commentators on Fox News. And so as a result, I expect this to be a very much of an entertaining, but ultimately harmonious type of discussion. And we'll see whether or not Susan can keep it that way. So Susan, with that, thank you very much for the opportunity today. Let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you for that generous introduction. I really am delighted to be here moderating this conversation between Donna and Newt. And in addition to the fact that, as Eric said, they are much better behaved than Karl Rove and Jim Carville, they also go back a fair ways. They've known each other for a long time, and despite their allegiance to different parties, they have known each other and worked together for a long time. So I'd love to start with just having the audience hear a little bit more about that long relationship you two have had. So Donna, you want to start by giving us a sense of how far back you and the speaker do actually go?
Well, I had the great honor of working on Capitol Hill for many, many years, working for Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton in the District of Columbia, being on the House Post Office and Civil Service Committee back in the day, working for the Honorable Dick Gephardt. I started my political career on Capitol Hill working for someone who was just an incredible lawmaker, Congressman Gillis Long, along with his wife, Kathy Long. I came out of Louisiana, came out of LSU after graduating in 1981, came straight to Capitol Hill, intern, and then I had an opportunity again to work on the effort to make Martin Luther King's birthday a national holiday. And so my favorite story about the former speaker is that he's probably the first Republican I've ever had to, I enjoyed working with, because I had to organize a town hall meeting here in Washington, D.C. And one of the most, I would say one of the biggest, most diverse wards in the city, not far from Capitol Hill. It drew a record attendance, and Marion Barry gave me credit for bringing Newt Gingrich to the hood. So, and he performed well. It was a great event. We got a lot accomplished, but more importantly, working on Capitol Hill during the time that the Republicans regained control of the House after decades of being left out. It was truly an honor to have access to his staff, Jack Howard, Robert George. He had an open door, and if you love dinosaurs and getting a good view of the Washington Monument during sunset, you can always go over to the Speaker's office, because he's still quite the gentleman. And I can go on and on about Newt Gingrich and his beloved wife, who's a good friend, a fellow Catholic. I've been known to run into the Speaker on Sundays, not far from here at the Basilica in Washington, D.C. So it's always a good honor to see him and to make sure he's doing all right so I can catch up with the next book.
That's great. Well, thanks so much, Donna. And Newt, I'm going to give you a turn now. You obviously and Donna go back a long time. What are your memories of some of your engagement with her?
Let me just say, I think I was probably preconditioned to enjoy Donna because I went to Tulane and spent 3 years in New Orleans. And I think if you've had that experience, you have some affinity that's different than folks who've never truly experienced what life is like in New Orleans. So I've always had a lot of affection for her. I probably am the speaker who took most seriously the idea that Washington is our national capital. And it's not just a city by itself, but it ought to be a place we can be proud of. We'd had a lot of difficulties in the decade or so before I became speaker. And in order to work with Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was the representative from Washington, Donna was her top person. And so we really did a lot of things together. And I must say, some of the bills we passed, which created a tax structure that encouraged people to move in and encouraged an opportunity really to have new buildings and a whole investment in infrastructure. The city today is just dramatically better. And that's because there was a genuine bipartisan coalition. And we worked on it together. It wouldn't have happened without it. Now, after that, we probably are throwbacks. I hadn't thought about it this way, but I think it's fair to say Donna and I both are very proud partisans. She can explain the Democratic Party. I can explain the Republican Party. But we're also people beyond our partisanship. So we can also have a drink. We can sit around and talk. I can learn more about her relatives. She's done amazingly good things with her nieces and nephews and really helped a number of them in ways that changed their lives dramatically. And Calista and she get along well. Calista sang at the Basilica for 20 years. So we really did have, in fact, we'll be back there tomorrow. And we're home for a couple of weeks. And so we really had an affection about life and about a lot of things that weren't political, which then sort of surrounded our political partisanship. And she is a fierce partisan. I'm sure much of the stuff she's going to say in a minute I will disagree with deeply. And I probably won't convince her of a single thing in what I'm going to say. But we nonetheless can have great affection for each other and can enjoy this process of self-government.
And Susan, I want to say something because the speaker forgot to mention, in addition to helping the district with its finances and putting it on a better path to fiscal health and growth and opportunity, bringing first-time homeowners back into the city, we created a program that allowed district residents, students who graduated from district high school, to apply to go to state universities across the country and pay a state tuition, not an out-of-state tuition. So that's another reason why I've maintained a close relationship. Look, out of 5 ideas that Newt Gingrich will present to you, I guarantee you 2.5 I will help him with. The other 2.5 I'll say maybe next time. But he's a man of ideas, he's a man of vision, and like I said, we don't have to agree. I just have to respect the fact, like George Will, like so many other staunch conservatives, that they have a vision. What is the vision? So that I can see if we can find some common sense solutions and some practical ways to make it happen. So I just want to continue to think of it because I get people come up to me and say, hey, I want to thank you and Eleanor Holmes Norton. I say, well, you got to add Newt Gingrich and Trent Lott and, a lot of other people, Tom Davis, but it was part of his leadership that allows so many of our students here to be able to go to state colleges across the country.
Well, thanks to both of you because you're getting us off on such a wonderful note. It's important to remember that there was an era in the past when people reached across the aisle, and it can happen again. And obviously it's happening right now before our very eyes. So thank you again, as I say, for getting us off on a really positive note. So we are, as Brian said, 5 days away from a truly historic election in circumstances that we could not possibly have written, even if we have the most dramatic flares of Hollywood writers at our disposal. We're in the midst of a historic pandemic, a recession, a major national reckoning with race relations in the wake of the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and this week of Walter Wallace, the mentally ill man who was shot by police in Philadelphia. We have widespread protests going on in Philadelphia today. And we have a lot of other historic phenomena. We're 5 days from an election and 75 million people have already voted. When in our history has that ever occurred? Now, the polls, the national polls at the moment do show Vice President Biden about 9 points ahead. He's not doing quite as well as the Moss Adams audience said. I think they had an even bigger margin. But the national polls are where they are, with Biden about 9 points ahead. We will recall that 4 years ago, the polls had Hillary Clinton ahead, and we know what the outcome of the election was. So there is uncertainty remaining. There's also uncertainty remaining about the control of the Senate, as we know. Senate is in balance. It does look as if the Democrats will retake the House, but we can have some discussion about it. And then we also have a number of gubernatorial races up, 11 in total, with 3 states probably likely to stay in Democratic hands and 7 in Republican hands. So this is just an amazing time. And as people have said over and over again, probably the most momentous election in our lifetimes. So with that backdrop, Donna and Newt, I'd love to get your forecast of what we will see as of Tuesday and beyond in the presidential race and the other down ballot races to come. So Donna, let's start with you on that.
Well, first of all, thank you again, Susan, and thank you for allowing us to give our commentary. 4 years ago, I can remember practically every day, every hour, because it really was an amazing experience to see Secretary Clinton up in the polls on September 24th, and then maintain a steady lead up through October 7th, when that was the big day when the intelligence community said that the Russians were in the process of interfering with our elections. And then we had the Access Hollywood tape. A few days later, another Wikipedia dump. And then, as you all know, on 10/28, James Comey announced that he would reopen an investigation. Her numbers began to drop in the closing days of the campaign. I was quoted in the New York Times that we had just been hit by a 18-wheeler. The Clinton campaign did not like that, but I'm like, you can tell when the bottom comes from underneath you. I saw that happen after September 11th when she lost her balance due to pneumonia. But the campaign was able to sort of get back on track. And by Election Day, my worry was that there were several states that were still calling me. I'm the chair of the party. The speaker understands when you call the chair, that's a 911 call. And I'm like, Ed Rendell on the phone, the former governor of Pennsylvania, he said, Madam Chair, I need $300,000 more. I'm having a hard time with some of the early voting and, of course, in Philadelphia. And I'm like, you need money from me? I'm the down ballot person. I'm the non-battleground person. I mean, you guys, the Clinton people had 15 states, and I had the rest of the country, which is a lot of territory. But I'm not supposed to receive a call from Pennsylvania. And then I got one from Jennifer Granholm in Michigan, complaining, like Ed Rendell, that there were no resources. And the final call, and I received a lot of other calls, but the final call was from Bill Clinton, and he said, are you hearing what I'm hearing? And I'm like, if you're hearing what I'm hearing, then we might be in trouble. We could not convince Robbie Moot that the data was wrong, the algorithms were off, and that she could fall short. So I predicted that Trump could, in fact, crack a couple of blue walls. I was the only person internally that kept saying Trump is real. He's not some person that should not be taken seriously. Trump is real. Trumpism is real. I can't tell you how many states. I think I did 38 states that cycle, but I can tell you in Nevada, I went 7 times, never put anything in a slot machine. I mean, I was just going around telling the Clinton people this is real, Trump is real, because I was actually talking to people and not to a computer. You all saw what happened. All right, so fast forward, and I'm sorry I'm taking so long, Mr. Speaker, but fast forward. The Biden people are different than the Trump people. They're different. Why? Because they recognize is that elections are won on the margins. And we know that while he's been leading, there's still some weaknesses out there. And we know that, like 2016, if you're not touching voters who participated in 2008 and 2012, but then came out in 2018, but forgot about 2016, those infrequent voters are key. So Biden is paying attention. 2, Biden is also targeting first-time voters and young voters. Young voters are the key to this election. They're also infrequent voters, but their numbers are up. And I also think Biden is doing one more thing, and that is, in addition to playing defense in those 3 states that President Trump was able to carry in 2016 because the Democrats left the door wide open, Biden is also putting resources in states that Democrats haven't competed in decades. And I'm talking about my good friend here in Georgia. I mean, if Georgia's on the Democrats' mind, then, please, I'm excited. Texas, if Texas go blue, even if it looks purple, more purple, that's a good sign for some of the down ballot candidates in that great state. And of course, Ohio, a bellwether state for Republicans, is one that is still within reach for Democrats. Look, Democrats have to still be concerned about the 2nd congressional district in Maine and Minnesota. And yes, we can't take some of the western states in Nevada for granted because Trump is doing a phenomenal job with minority men, both Black and Hispanic men. He's doing a terrible job with white college-educated women. Biden is taking advantage of that. And he's doing a horrible job with young people. We're taking advantage of that. And seniors who loved Trump in 2016 seem not to care so much this time. So if the election was tomorrow, I would give it to Biden. But 5 days is a long time. And as I tell people, I'm the person in the Democratic family that like to get out the vote. And now I like to count the vote. And when I see that Susan is actually up to 80,339,247 people. Over 52 million have voted by mail, 28 million in person. But here's something that Newt would love, and I'm going to turn over the balance of my time. Mr. Speaker, guess how many outstanding ballots there are right now where people have requested ballots but not turned them in? 38 million people. 38 million Americans are holding on to ballots right now. They have not turned them in. If anybody want to start opening up champagne, I love to drink. But if anybody want to start opening up champagne or start drinking or figuring out what the quote-unquote the room size of the curtains, go ahead. I'm not one of those Democrats. This is going to come down to every last single vote being counted. And I mean every last single vote, including those possibly 1.2 million military votes coming in late. It matters this time. This is going to be a close one. So start worrying like me and get those ballots in if you know there are 38 million outstanding ballots.
Well, thank you, Donna. Just a wonderful historical perspective on why it ain't over until it's over. Newt, you had a column, an op-ed on the Fox News website today saying, as you watch this current campaign cycle, you're reminded by the past assumptions of the Washington establishment and your sense is that a lot of people think that they have this in the bag and they don't. You tend to agree with Donna on that. Tell us a little bit more about why you feel that way.
Well, let me start and say that for everybody who's watching who is interested in how this business works, one of the places where Donna and I are exactly parallel is we focus on the politics of people, and we focus on trying to get a sense of what is the conversation in the country. And in a funny kind of way, it's a wonderful old novel and movie called The Last Hurrah, which is about a great Irish ward politician in Boston. And he's being defeated by a totally fabricated, television-based, modern technology, a so-called reformer. And that's, in a sense, the tension that exists in our system. As Donna said, and both parties have suffered from this, but Hillary's campaign manager had a theoretical model which was terrific, except it didn't relate to the world. And so there were obvious indicators, and of course, Bill Clinton, who was one of the great politicians of our lifetime, intuitively understood that there were things happening out there that weren't being picked up on, because one of the dangers of models is models always reflect what you know about the past, but they don't tell you if the present is evolving into a different future. You won't catch that for 2 or 3 cycles. So I did a Megyn Kelly show 2 weeks before the election in 2016. And she walked me through the polling numbers. Because we started the show, she said, what's going to happen? I said, oh, well, Trump's going to win. And she said, well, how can you say that? Look at the polls in Pennsylvania. And we did Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. In each case, I said to her, look, you and I live in 2 parallel universes. In your parallel universe, that poll's right, and Clinton's going to win. In my parallel universe, that poll's wrong, and Trump's going to win. And we'll find out election night which universe is real. I think we're in exactly the same position. I would say that the polling industry is almost totally out of touch now with reality. We got a poll yesterday out of the field, I think Washington Post, ABC, that said that Trump was 17 points behind in Wisconsin. Now, I think Donna, she may disagree if she thinks I'm way off, but I think she'll agree with me just as a practical professional. The Wisconsin fight, starting with Scott Walker, has been so ferocious. The state is so polarized that somebody might be 3, 4, 5, 6 points, but it's impossible for either the Republican or the Democrat to be 17 points ahead in a state which has been in this long struggle for a decade. So you look at that and you think, what's going on? And it's mostly misinformation. I look at 4 polls, basically. Trafalgar is the first one. Susquehanna is the second one. Zogby's the third. And a guy named Kasheshian, who used to do polling for Ronald Reagan. You look at their polls, Trump is either tied or ahead in virtually every state that matters. He's going to carry Florida by a good margin. He's going to carry Ohio, I think, by an uncontestable margin. And you go around the country and you suddenly realize there's one analysis that came out yesterday that has Trump carrying 326 electoral votes. And I think that's probably about right. And I think it'll be an enormous shock. But the reason is, I'll just say this and then close, we can go to Q&A or to conversation. I've been at this a very long time. I've actually been at this longer than Donna has. And I started doing this stuff in 1960. And what you have is an underlying culture of relative conservatism, not hard right, but broadly conservatism. The people who stand for the flag and stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And think of that as the Gulf Stream. It's this huge underlying wave of water. And above it, you have these storms caused by the news media that are making lots of noise. They're very exciting. And they create waves, but the waves are all up here. And the waves dominate except for Election Day, because they're the people who make the waves. And then on Election Day, that huge river, and of course nowadays our election's about an election 6 or 7 weeks. But when people walk in to vote, suddenly this huge river of water reappears. And this has been consistently true now, at least since, I would say, 1976 or 1980. So my guess is Trump will get reelected, and that it'll come as an enormous shock.
Well, and I want to point out that when you were with the Moss Adams group in 2016, you said the same thing, and a lot of people thought you were wrong, but you were proven quite right on that. So, Donna, you were going to say something?
And I agree in terms of what some of the ripple effects that we see in the electorate. But this electorate is totally dissatisfied. They're very pessimistic. And as a result of that, we're seeing some surprising, I think, data with not only first-time voters, but youth voters. That may, I think, stir the so-called wave in a different direction because they have no faith. They've lost faith. And while in 2016, President Trump, or then candidate Trump, was the outsider. He was anti-establishment. He was riding on the trade deals, immigration. He was riding on a form of populism that guaranteed that he could build a coalition of disaffected Democrats and to bring in a new wave of Republican voters who did not show up in 2012 for Mitt Romney. What I've seen over the last 4 years, and especially the last 4 months, and this is even with the coronavirus surging and then, going stable for a few weeks or months, and then now back up surging. But what I'm seeing in some of this movement is that people are more engaged in voting against Trump than voting for Biden. This is a referendum on the president. And unlike 2016, when they were both unpopular, the president remains underwater, and there's no president that's ever been elected, at least in the last 50 years, where they were able to outperform their personal approval ratings. So if he's at 43%, and if he's unable to move those numbers, he's going to probably come in about 44, 46%. And Biden has the ability to break 48%. But again, 5 days is a long time in politics. When you look at these margins in 2016, Maine, Trump margin less than 3%. Nevada, the margin was less than 3%. Minnesota, the margin was less than 1.52. New Hampshire, 0.037. Michigan, 0.23 in favor of Trump, of course. Pennsylvania, 0.72 in favor of Trump. Wisconsin, 0.77 in favor of Trump. Florida, 1.2 in favor of Trump. And then Arizona, 3.5 and 3.6, North Carolina, both in favor of Trump. Those numbers are all down. They're now either tied or they're leaning Biden. And I think his path in 2020 is a little bit more difficult because the doors are locking up in those 3 Rust Belt states. And he's going to have to, and I don't know all of the analogy, I know more sports and cooking metaphors than card games. I don't gamble, so I don't even know card games. Last card game I played was Monopoly. But I think he's going to need an inside straight. He's going to have to pick, if he loses those Rust Belts, then he's going to have to get North Carolina, Florida, and then keep Arizona in the red column as well. And God knows what's going to happen in Georgia, like I mentioned earlier. I don't know where that's coming from, but there's a lot of energy coming out of Georgia. And I think they're close to 9 million voted already in Texas. That's more than 74% of the people who turned out in 2016.
Well, let's talk a bit about the unique dynamics of this election that is all around this early voting phenomenon. And the fact that in some of the battleground states, that's going to play a role. There was a piece on the 538 website today about what could happen in Pennsylvania. If Pennsylvania ends up being the state that puts Biden over the top, which it might, we don't know, the supposition is we may not know that for a day or two because with all the early balloting, the state election people cannot start counting those ballots until the election day morning. So it could be, their theory goes, that there'll be a big piece of the in-person Republican vote that shows up first before a lot of the blue vote shows up being counted later. Those dynamics, as we know, could play out in other states as well. How do we think Tuesday night is going to unfold and Wednesday? And what do we think about, and then of course we've got other concerns like potential problems in polling places with threats of violence and so on. what do you two think? How are we going to get through this election day and into the week that follows? Newt, let me start with you on that.
Well, I think you have three futures. You have a big Biden win, in which case you'll know early Wednesday morning. You have a big Trump win, in which case you'll know Wednesday morning. Or you have a real contest, in which case you'll know the week after the election. I think it'll take, if it's a real contest, I could easily imagine it taking until the week after, 7 or 8 or 9 days. And again, Donna has much more experience than I do at this, because she was there in 2000 when what looked like a pleasant evening suddenly became a nightmare. What did it take, 23 days to solve the West Palm Beach problem?
It took almost 30. A month.
Yeah. So, and New York just had a primary this summer for Congress, which I think took 9 weeks to count the vote. So I've sort of kept an open schedule, because in my mind, the election's not going to be over when they have the election, because the counting, the lawsuits, the back and forth, the efforts in the news media, all that stuff's going to go on and on. I think I wouldn't be at all surprised to see us at Thanksgiving, still not quite sure.
Donna, what do you think?
You know, I just hope and pray that we can get it right. I lived through those long days of trying to get it right. I can tell you from being in the room at 9:49 p.m. when Al Gore placed a call, he asked Mr. Daley to give him the number to George Bush, Joe, give the chief of staff, the vice president, because I was right there in the room and I watched him. I had my umbrella in my hand because it was raining that night in Nashville. And before we were leaving, with a victory speech, he called and conceded. And as we were in the car, going over, you know, with a different speech, we got word, and it came through Michael Hooley, and it came up through me to Michael Feldman, because Michael Feldman was in the car. He's married to Savannah Guthrie, otherwise I wouldn't be name dropping here. But Michael Feldman jumped out the car to reach the vice president before he went on and said, we have to bring it back into the whole room. We brought him back to the whole room, and that's when we learned, because of the election law, we would go into overtime. And what's going to happen on election night, depending on how close it is, there will be automatic recounts. And then there will be the Trump campaign could contest the results of the Biden campaign. I'm sure the only other rich person in the country of these elections, the other outside of the pollsters who always get it wrong, but they're like water, the weather people, they can get it wrong and keep a job. But all of the advertisers, because they're all on TV, but the lawyers, both campaigns are lawyered up. The Supreme Court has already ruled on 2 more states today, allowing them to extend the deadline to count all of these 38 million plus votes that have not been turned in. I hope we can all exercise patience and calm. It was very tough as a campaign manager to have to call the head of the labor movement, the head of the civil rights groups, and say, don't go down to Florida. We're not trying to create a chaos. And yet, you know, we had the Brooks brothers knock on the glass. Counting the votes should not be a crisis. We better get it right. And I want to say one last thing. As you all know, and I have to say this again, those military budgets will come, ballots will come in late. Georgia, I believe, it will come in sometime after the election, November 6th. Texas is November 9th. North Carolina is November 12th. And of course, Michigan, I think, is November 17th. And I mean, I should know all of them by now, but I'm working on that. The point I'm making is that in 2000, Mr. Lieberman said, we got to count those votes. And we kept saying, no, we got to hurry up. And he said, no, we got to count those military votes. In the end, when the Supreme Court made the decision, Al Gore called me and said, shut it down. And my first reaction was, shut it down? I can't. And he's like, shut it down. And we shut it down. And as you know, we proceeded to have a peaceful transfer of power. In 2016, I was in the room. Barack Obama was saying to Hillary, it's over. I heard that. I heard those words. I heard the conversation after Wisconsin was coming in, and we called Gwen Moore. Mr. Speaker, you'll love this. We called Gwen Moore. We said, are there any more votes in Milwaukee? We were begging. I mean, are there any more precincts outstanding? We knew to call, right? She said, no more precincts. And we knew Michigan was gone. I knew from that whole day that Pennsylvania was an absolute mess. And yeah, Donald Trump claimed victory at 229. Hillary did not concede until the next morning, but there was a clear winner. We got to make sure this time we get all of the votes in so that we, as Americans, we're confident of the results.
So by the way,
I had a friend in 1986, Connie Mack, who was a House member who ran for the Senate and who was behind election night in Florida. And I think they had 180,000 ballots out that were military. And over the following 2 or 3 weeks, he eventually won the Senate seat. But literally, it took weeks for all the ballots to come in. So again, you're going to have a couple of states that are close. If you have a big military ballot, that could easily change the equation over the following week or two.
And the deadline in Florida this time, I believe, is November 13th to get those ballots in. Look, we cannot disenfranchise our military. We got to ensure that those ballots are counted. And look, you also have the Southern Command based in Dorrell, and you have the Naval Station based in Jacksonville. I'm also a daughter of a military, guys. So I have to tell you, we want to make sure that every American, but our military, and those ballots could take a couple more days, but there are deadlines. And if this is a tight election, 537 votes, remember 2000, some of us can't forget. But if it's a close election, the military, I think the president would want to see the military votes counted, and I'm sure the vice president as well.
Absolutely. Well, Newt, you brought up Connie Mack in the Senate. Let's talk briefly about the Senate. But before we do that, I do want to bring up the next polling question, which is asking this important question: who is going to take control of the Senate or retain control of the Senate through this election? And for all the obsession that we have with the presidential race, we know that who has control of the Senate is extremely important, particularly it would be in the event of a Biden victory. If he doesn't have the Senate and only has the House, that would seriously limit his ability to carry out any agenda. So let's bring up that poll. Who do you think is going to have control of the Senate as of January? The Republicans or the Democrats? Let's go ahead and take that vote, if you would, quickly, folks. And it looks like we've got about half of the voters casting their ballots here. Let's see what everybody says about this. And then I'll be interested to hear what Donna and Newt think about the Senate and some of these key Senate races now that are also going down to the wire in terms of who is likely to win. And probably, I don't know that we know that the count is going to come in any faster in some of those big states where there are important Senate races. So as you can see here, this group thinks that we'll have if your assessment is correct, this group believes we'll have a split government, that we might have a Democrat in the White House, but the Senate will remain in Republican control. So what do you think, Newt? Where do you think the Senate's going to end up?
No, I think we keep the Senate. The question's the size of the margin. And so the Senate races are very unique. The year Nixon won, carrying all but I think 2 states in 72, we lost Senate seats in the middle of a landslide, because each Senate race is big enough and unique enough that it sort of creates its own gravity in addition to the presidential campaign. But my guess is, on balance, we'll pick up Alabama for sure. We may well lose a couple seats. I don't want to single anybody out, but we also may have a couple people who survive who are in very tough races. Susan Collins being probably the best example of somebody who's a great local senator in a state that's small enough. You really can know everybody. But my guess would be that Mitch will be at a minimum at 52 and could be as high as 55, depending on what happens in the various seats. And this is a place where, for example, if Trump does carry Arizona, McSally probably wins. If Trump loses Arizona, pretty hard for me to see how McSally, the senator, gets reelected.
Donna, what's your sense?
Well, I think as a result of great recruitment, I was looking for my latest polling, and like I said, I don't have favorite polling, but I do pay attention to the polls. I do believe that there is a possibility that Democrats can take control of the Senate in large part because it is a referendum on the president, and there are Democrats who are turning out who did not participate in 2016. And so I like to tell the Speaker the states that I believe the Democrats have an opportunity. And of course, number one on the list, he mentioned, it's the great state of Maine. I think voters saved Susan Collins last time, but this time around she has a great competitor in Sarah Gideon. And I think that's one that if Democrats continue to do the work that they've been doing, I think that's a great pickup for Democrats. In North Carolina, just a few weeks ago, I thought Cal Cunningham could indeed overcome and beat the incumbent, Tom Tillis. But as some of you might have heard in North Carolina, he's been dealing with a little bit of scandal. And it's one of those kind that taints you right before the election. And he's still trying to get ahead of the stories that came out about an alleged affair with someone that is not his spouse. And I'll leave it at that. You want to see the salacious details, I'm sure it's out there. But you know what? That race is still a little bit on the tight side. So who knows? And then, of course, Georgia, 2 seats. And I think Democrats have a great opportunity to pick up one of those 2 seats. Now, I don't know which one it will be, and I pray to God that we don't go all the way to January 5th, because then you get into my Super Bowl time. And I don't want that to happen. But I do believe that the Democrats have a shot. Mitch McConnell is doing good so far in Kentucky. Tennessee, again, it's not a seat that I think the Democrats put a lot of resources in it, but Marquita Bradshaw is still polling in the 30s. She's not going to be able to win that open seat. Now, Mississippi is interesting because Cindy Hyde-Smith is almost neck and neck with Mike Espy. It's a rematch from last time, and that race is close. But, here's the problem for Democrats, which is why the Speaker said Alabama and Doug Jones will likely lose. Well, you don't invest in these states, and you don't put a lot of resources for 20 years, and you don't campaign for 20 years, then it's hard to have the infrastructure that you need to overcome some of the odds. And so both races, while they're interesting, just like South Carolina, where, as you know, Lindsey Graham has a very, very well-funded challenger in Jamie Harrison. Again, this is the South. States that Democrats have not put a lot of resources, but these Senate seats are ones that Democrats are looking at. But where's another pickup opportunity? Well, Colorado's a pickup opportunity because I think John Hickenlooper, the former governor, has an advantage over Cory Gardner. I think that's great. And then Arizona, astronaut Mark Kelly. I saw last night Martha McSally was on the stage with Trump after the debate where she was like, well, I don't really know. But last night she was on the stage. But that's another potential pickup opportunity. Texas Cornyn seemed to be holding strong against his opponent, M.J. Hager. But the one that there are 2 more. And the one is in Iowa. Joni Ernst, the incumbent, was doing very good. I mean, she was doing good. She was staying above water until the last debate, when I don't think she knew the price of soybeans. Now, when the Hawkeye State, you got to know the price of corn and soybeans. I mean, that's important. Just like in Louisiana, you know that there are 4 seasons: shrimp, crab, crawfish, and oysters. You typically know this stuff. So Teresa Greenfield and Joni Ernst, that might be a race to watch on election night. Another state that I'm concerned about, I feel better about Tina Smith in Minnesota. Gary Peters has a stiff, good, strong opponent. I think that's going to be a race that we also should look at. Bottom line is, can Democrats get 3 seats to take control? Yes. Can they get 4 seats? Possibly. Will they get 60? No. Just have fun watching these races.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the role of the pandemic. We know that this has just thrown complete chaos into certainly Donald Trump's agenda for getting reelected. He was intending to make the election all about the good performance, strong performance of the economy, the stock market, et cetera. And now a lot of the discussion is obviously about the pandemic. We are on track we have almost 230,000 Americans having died. It looks like we're on track for 400,000 deaths between now and the end of the year, more deaths in the United States than any country in the world. And nationally, 6 in 10 Americans say they disapprove of his handling of the pandemic, the president's handling of the pandemic, I mean. What do we think, Newt, back to your scenario in which Trump is victorious, is this, again, just noise about the pandemic? And then substantively, has the administration made mistakes, and should it pay a political price at this point? Or do you see that as more noise also generated by the news media and everybody else?
Well, I think they're very different questions. The pandemic clearly changed the whole trajectory of this year. I wrote a book called Trump and the American Future, and I finished it at the end of February, and it was a triumphalist book. Lowest black unemployment in history, lowest Latino unemployment in history. Things were fabulous. 30 days later, I was rewriting the book because COVID had arrived, and you couldn't write a triumphalist book going into a pandemic. So start with the notion, of course this has had, and this is the biggest single impact on the 2020 election. And it made Trump vulnerable, where I think actually in February he was cruising to a Nixon-Reagan style reelection. And then it all fell apart. Second, of course they made mistakes, but a lot of the mistakes they made were the public health service. I had Dr. Fauci. I do a podcast at Gingrich 360, and I had Dr. Fauci on in February, early February, and he reassured us that this was not a pandemic. This was more like SARS. We didn't need to overreact. So I think it's a little bit ahistorical to go back and just talk about Trump. I think there are profound problems in our public health system, and in many cases, the president actually was doing a better job than his advisors. It was his instinct to close off China long before anybody else. It was his instinct to launch an aggressive Manhattan Project-style approach to vaccines. When normal bureaucrats said that's a 4-year project, Trump's going to get it done in 9 months to 12 months. So those things are real. The other thing I'd point out that he's going to get no advantage from, but that is an objective fact. For months, we were told how much better the Europeans were. Well, France just closed down. Germany just closed down. Spain not only closed down last week, the Spanish prime minister said they were off, but then instead of having 1 million people with COVID, they had 3 million. So the numbers we've been measuring against were nonsense. Italy has closed down again in large part. All restaurants have to close at 6 p.m. Very different environment. So it is a problem. If that wasn't there, Trump would probably be coasting to a 55 or 58% victory. But it is there, and it's a burden he's got to carry. I don't think he's always carried it very well, and I think that as a result, he's had a harder re-election than he should have.
Donna, the vice president obviously has lost little chance to attack Donald Trump for the handling of the pandemic. If he were to be elected, though, this problem lands right in his lap. We are now told that there won't be a vaccine, in all likelihood, effective against COVID-19 until at least January, available for distribution across the land. And then in addition to that, there are some very controversial things that he's going to have to confront, one of which is he's talked about the potential of a national mask mandate. And we know across the country, governors have been reluctant, if not adamantly opposed to, in many instances, imposing mask mandates. So from a political perspective, how do you think the pandemic would await Joe Biden if he were to be elected?
Well, I think it is going to be the number one issue and concern. And now that there's the prospect of a stimulus package happening before the election or even immediately following the election, just based on what I saw today from both the White House as well as the speaker, they're still miles apart, not in the underlying number perhaps, but some of the details of what's in the bill, whether it's state and local funding, state safe schools, tax credits, unemployment insurance. They're still far apart, but the good news is that there's a line of communication, and perhaps if that can be put to rest, and there's adequate funding for testing and tracing, the vice president will have to work with state governors on a mask mandate. Look, throughout the early few weeks of this pandemic, I was tasked with yet another opportunity. The mayor of the District of Columbia called. We are not a state, and so, of course, we had to fend for ourselves and, of course, try to work with the federal government. And so immediately I said to the mayor, of course, I'm not afraid to work with the federal government. I worked with the federal government during Hurricane Katrina. I was a private citizen, but I thought, George W. Bush had a big task on his hand. And so I just went over to the White House, called my friend Karl Rove. And yes, he did return my calls. And I went over there, and for 3 years, I had no problems working with the Bush administration to help revitalize and rebuild the Gulf Coast. So I was tasked with working with the equity and vulnerability community here in the District of Columbia, along with the mayor of Howard University. And I recognized right away that we had to work with the federal government. Why? Because when we start looking at where the hot spots, we said, wait a minute, that's federal property. This is district, but this is federal. And we had a great relationship, but the information coming from the White House would change almost by the day. And I watched every 5 p.m. Press conference. In fact, I would not go out and walk my dog. I used to tell my doggie, she's from South Carolina, so she has patience. I said, Zora, we can't walk until after the president, because I wanted to see. It's almost like the president was on one track and his team, and then the scientists and the doctors, they were on this track, and I think the rest of us got caught somewhere in the middle trying to figure out everything. It has been a calamity to see that we could not get on one page through this pandemic. And if we change the course of this virus, we know we can continue to change the course of our economy, to get it back up, to get small businesses funded so that we can get people back to work. So this is a problem. And yes, it lays in the president's lap because he is the president of the United States of America during a pandemic.
So we know that the pandemic...
I want you to go to JoeBiden.com. Joe Biden has come up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The problem with Democrats, if you ask me, and I'm a Democrat, they have seven different areas that they're going to tackle on day one to try to mitigate this crisis and improve how we go about getting a vaccine distributed. They have mask mandates, but they know that the only way to implement that is by working with governors and mayors and asking the American people to do what they must do best, which is step up at a time in crisis. So that's the Biden plan, JoeBiden.com. I don't want to mess up his plan by telling you what I like and what I think won't work, but this is the Biden plan. I think it's substantive. I think it's good. But I wish the president would have followed either the scientists or the doctors or got the best possible team in the White House to handle this crisis and not do it piecemeal and by tweet.
So to stay on the subject of the pandemic, we know that it has shown the U.S. healthcare system at its best and its worst. We see the best in terms of the care of people with COVID improving. We know that death rates are down, even of COVID patients who are hospitalized, that there's really been a dramatic improvement in the care of people with COVID in just a few short months. So that's the good side of this. The not so good side is, as we know, we've got 2 to 3 times as many Blacks and Hispanics experiencing COVID than whites. Those death rates among those populations are similarly distorted and higher. We also know that this comes in the midst of all the racial unrest that we've experienced this year. And a recent poll out from the Kaiser Family Foundation and the group Undefeated shows that 7 in 10 Black Americans think that the healthcare system discriminates against them and that they lack access to care, sufficient care, because of that. And we also know that many Americans now are extremely skeptical about a vaccine, taking a vaccine, and not just Black Americans. I saw recent numbers that said that about half of Black Americans don't intend to get a vaccine because they're worried that it will be rushed through for political reasons. And 6 in 10 overall Americans say they're going to wait for a vaccine because they're skeptical of it. They're going to wait and see if other groups get it, how things go, and then they might consider getting it. So, Newt, I want to pose this question to you. This is really a glaring example of inequity in our healthcare system being experienced by people. And as you said, this is all about people, how people feel. What do you make of all of this, and how do we begin to make inroads into what is obviously a terrible crisis in our healthcare system?
Well, I think, first of all, that it simply surfaces some objective realities, some of which I think challenge the very assumptions of people who claim to care most about the poor. Medicaid turns out to be a very bad health system. And the fact is that we don't today have, for relatively poor Americans, a system which would focus on dealing with chronic conditions. I mean, the number one reason that you have higher mortality rates with COVID with people who come from poor neighborhoods or poor backgrounds is the fact that they have comorbidities. Diabetes would be a good example, that aren't treated correctly. And as a result, they have vulnerabilities that they would not have if they were in a better circumstance. So I think we have to profoundly rethink how we approach this entire area of reforming the health system. And I think that the steps that the president's taking, which are towards transparency and cost and quality, giving people information to force the system to reform itself. There's these large bureaucracies, including these giant hospital systems, they're not going to reform themselves. They're going to take the money, do what they feel like doing, and the result's going to be substantial inequities. If you're wealthy enough, you can get a doctor who pays attention. You probably have pretty good discipline if you're that wealthy, and so you actually pay attention to the doctor, and you are less likely to have the comorbidities, or if you do have them, you're more likely to know to take very careful precautions and not put yourself in a risky circumstance. However, if you go into an anonymous system where you're a client and where people don't actually pay attention to you, and you're used to the idea of being neglected, you maximize the number of comorbidities, and that maximizes the potential death rate. I mean, I think the current system, without getting into a fight over Obamacare or anything else, I think we need to profoundly rethink how we deal with healthcare in America, and not necessarily in ways that most of the healthcare critics would suggest.
Well,
Donna?
let me just say, even for people with health insurance, our healthcare system is too expensive and too hard to navigate. And we're losing a lot of people. I can speak from experience as someone who grew up in poverty. Both my parents worked. That more poor people work than I think most people understand and realize. They work to make ends meet. They work to provide for their families. They work to provide, for their futures. But the truth is that we have to deal with some underlying problems in our, not just our healthcare system, but the way in which we treat people who may not have the means to afford healthcare. I was born in Charity Hospital, New Orleans. Charity Hospital, by the way, it's no longer there, but thanks to George Bush, we now have a level, really a top-level trauma center that replaced it that is very, very good in helping people who have these underlying conditions. But how do you blame people in neighborhoods that don't have grocery stores or access to farmers market or fresh food? How do you blame them when they can't find primary care physicians, when they cannot get the kind of care they need to take care of themselves? And how can they afford the medications that they're prescribed, rationing their diabetes medication or their hypertension medication? I mean, there are so many underlying problems that when the mayor called on me, I said to the mayor, I said, look, the one thing I know is I know how poor people live. I happen to grow up poor, and let me tell you, I am still connected to these communities, and they need help. Just like I understood that the big banks were not lending to small businesses, I understood that poor people were not going to get access to the kind of treatment they needed, the kind of testing. So I said straight up, and I said, let's go to Dr. Ben Carson because he can help. I said, let us find mobile testing sites. Let's make sure, and the Republicans were there to help us, including Senator Scott, let's make sure that Howard University has resources to take care of people who might live, east of the United States Capitol. You have to work within the system to improve the system. And I have to agree with the speaker, while I don't want to see Obamacare destroyed or removed from the books, 20 million Americans would immediately lose their health care, and perhaps hundreds of million, over 100 million for pre-existing condition. Let's find ways to strengthen it. But health care should be something we can all find some common grounds. But I know that's just me being my Pollyannish, pie-in-the sky. I think I can help fix anything. But I'm worried about the fact that we have so many Americans, so many people of color. I mean, they can't get connected to a doctor. So I said, what about telemedicine? Then I said, wait a minute, they're not connected to the internet. I mean, what the hell are we supposed to do? Let folks die?
Let me build on that for a second. One of the things the administration, I think, has announced it's going to do is actually make the vaccines available for free and distributed through the drugstores, which have pretty massive penetration of the country, much more so than, say, the Public Health Service does. And I think there are certain common things we have to do that we frankly, it's in the long run cheaper to give it away. For example, cheaper to actually give away the vaccine and not have to take somebody to a hospital than it would be to limit the access to the vaccine if you'll pay for it. So I think there are things we can do, and I also think that I agree totally with Donna. One of our proposals on transparency, we think you can take 40% out of the cost of the health system by simply having real competition and real knowledge and having the people know what they're getting and what they're paying for.
Well, thank you for teeing up our next three poll questions, which we're going to get to in very short order. And then we'll go to some really great questions that are coming in from the audience. So the next of our poll questions, as you see here, about the ACA. Will the ACA survive its current challenge in the Supreme Court? Yes, it will survive, or no, it will be declared unconstitutional. So let's take a quick vote on that one from the audience. And of course, as we know, the arguments for that Supreme Court, in that Supreme Court case, will be heard just about a week after the election. So it's coming up. We don't expect a decision until next year. But as we know, this has been quite a bone of contention, particularly around the nomination and now confirmation of Justice Barrett to the Supreme Court. So let's see what people are thinking. Looks like we've got most attendees voting here now, and it looks like most people think it's going to survive, that the court is going to not strike down the Affordable Care Act over the fact that the penalty for the individual mandate was reduced to zero in the 2017 tax law. Okay, so let's go to the next polling question, if we could. This is another healthcare one. We started to get onto the notion of affordability of healthcare. We know a big issue that was teed up to be dealt with in the Congress this year, but then essentially receded, partly because of the pandemic, was pharmaceutical pricing. True or false, U.S. pharmaceutical prices are too high and need to be controlled via a new system of federal price regulation of some sort. We're not asking a specific scheme there, but what does the audience think about that? True, prices are too high and are going to need to be controlled, or not? And let's see how this vote comes out. And again, we know we may or may not have time to talk about it, but we know that the Trump administration has been very vociferous on the issue of high pharmaceutical prices, as has Vice President Biden, and the latter also has some plans to deal with that issue if he is elected. And of course, we know that a major bill passed the House on that earlier this year, a bipartisan effort in the Senate, however, got stuck and was not enacted. Okay, so true. 3/4 of you think the prices are too high and we don't have a choice but to regulate them. So that's a big split. Interesting to probe that a little bit more. We're going to go to the final question, and this is the one that Newt more or less just teed up, which is about price transparency. As we know, the major rule requiring hospitals to publish their prices, both their charge master prices as well as their negotiated prices with health insurers, takes effect in January. Is that going to lead to lower hospital prices overall? True or false? And let's see where the audience comes out on this one. Again, lots of debate, at least among economists, whether price transparency does in fact have that competitive effect that Newt spoke about, or whether it potentially could even raise prices as people see, boy, the hospital down the street is getting better prices than I thought. It's time for me to raise them. So not unanimity among economists what the effect is going to be there, but we'll find out as of next year. So let's see what the verdict was. It looks like true. 2/3 of you believe it's going to lower hospital prices. So we will see. Well, great. Well, thank you for taking those last 3 poll questions. We're now going to go back to a question that came in from a member of the audience, if we could. We're going to go to about 5:30 with this conversation, 5:30 Eastern time, wherever the rest of you are. Please do that hourly now. A question came in: do you believe the Electoral College will ever be challenged in favor of a direct popular vote? Is the question. And should swing states be able to decide an election, as in effect they have been doing in the battleground states in recent elections? Newt, you're the historian here. Why don't you start with that?
Well, I think that if you continue to get elections like 2000 and like 2016, where there's a significant gap between the popular vote and the electoral vote, at some point there will be enormous pressure to change the system. Part of the challenge will be that you're asking small states to turn power over to New York and California and Texas and Florida. And historically, at the Constitutional Convention, this was part of the compromise that enabled us to survive as a country, because the big states and the small states each had a model they liked. The small states loved the Senate model, where each state got 2, and the big states loved the House model, where it was by population. So it's very hard to imagine getting it done. It will be requested. I mean, there'll be a fight for it. But I would make a different point about it. If it had been a popular vote election, Trump would have campaigned in California. Remember that in 16, in the 49 states outside California, Trump had 1,300,000 vote margin. All of Hillary's majority came out of California. And frankly, it was pointed that Donna made about Democratic failure to invest in the South. We don't invest in California. So we basically give up the largest state in the country. And my guess, it's also why if you see a national survey that shows Biden up by 2 or 3, he's losing the Electoral College. Because what's happening is he's getting a huge majority out of New York, Illinois, and California. And if he's not up more than 2 or 3, all of that's absorbed by those 3 states. So he's actually probably behind in the other states.
Well, as you know,
maybe more than you want to know.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Speaker. As you all know, this past July, when the Supreme Court ruled that state electors are legally obligated to cast their vote for the winner of their state vote, it began another round of conversation. I think after the Gore campaign, Carl Rove and I were sitting on the stage with Ralph Nader's campaign manager and some of the other minor candidates, and here we sat there as major party representatives and said, "Oh hell no, it'll survive." I mean, we look back and said, "This is not 1876. It was at Tilden Hayes. This is bad, but we can fix it." But after 2000, we now have this organization, National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and it seeks to abolish the Electoral College without going through the near impossible task of changing the Constitution. It now has, I think, 196 electoral votes in Colorado. In this election cycle, they're going to vote on the measure now. And the polls show that it's evenly split, but there's a compact. I think Maryland and Connecticut signed on this year. So this is going to be an issue that we'll be talking about for the next decade. Hopefully I will not be involved in the next election where the winner of the popular vote lost the Electoral College. First of all, it means that I have to go back to Harvard because I've been to Harvard twice to study after that occurred. But hopefully we can get it right this time so we don't have another fishing expedition on what we should change in the Constitution.
Well, we shall see, right? So let's take another question that has come in. This is back to healthcare. And Newt, I think this is aimed at you. You've been advising the Trump administration on its healthcare plan. As we know, the president has periodically said a healthcare plan from the White House is imminent, but we have not seen that yet. This questioner asks, what exactly is the GOP plan for providing insurance coverage for Americans? And I think by extension, the question could be, since the president says that there will be a plan that guarantees that there is coverage for pre-existing conditions, what is that plan?
I think the essence of that plan is to have 100% coverage in guaranteed issue pools so that no American would be unable to buy insurance and to have enough of a cross subsidy that no prices would go up because you have to find one way or another to do it. We think it's easy. We think in the long run, you are better off to target the people who actually have preconditions than you are to try to change the entire system in order to try to get at it. So I think that that's a practical, doable thing. It could certainly be implemented through a combination of the states and the capacity of Medicaid and Medicare. And I think the president will almost certainly send something like that up in January.
So I think I want to make sure I heard you right. You said guaranteed issue. How is that different from the Affordable Care Act?
The Affordable Care Act doesn't target narrowly the people who actually need the help. We believe it's less expensive to focus directly on helping people who do have a challenge getting coverage. And as you know, we talk about huge numbers, but the truth is most of the people that are in the huge numbers are already covered. They're either covered by their employer or in many cases are covered by Medicare. So the number of people you're trying to cover who can't find insurance, you can create a guaranteed issue for insurance and require that be part of the process. And frankly, you can then have a tax on the insurance companies to subsidize that pool.
So in essence, you keep in effect guaranteed issue, as in the Affordable Care Act. You structure subsidies to help people get that coverage. Again, what's the difference between that and the Affordable Care Act?
Let me say, first of all, I'm not an expert in this. Joe DeSantis, who works with me, is pretty close to an expert on it. But I think part of the difference is the Affordable Care Act tried to draw everybody into a large enough risk pool. And in order to do that, they basically said to younger people who are healthy, we're going to fine you or make you pay a tax if you don't buy insurance. We actually have somebody we work with who spent 2 years paying the tax because the tax was cheaper than the insurance. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And so our point is you're much better off to have a national coverage in terms of the financing and then target it directly to the people who actually need some kind of additional help because they have a precondition. And I think so it's a question of where you try to structure the subsidy.
Okay, well, and presumably post-election, and certainly if the president is reelected, we'll see more details about that plan.
Yes.
All right, we're going to move to, I think, what will probably end up being our final question, but it's a very good one. The questioner asks, both of you represent an era in Washington where the leadership of the Congress did work with the president. And I'm remembering very much after the midterm elections of 1996, I believe it was, in 1997, we had the Balanced Budget Act. Newt, you worked very closely with the Clinton administration to get that enacted. The Balanced Budget Act was put through. The Children's Health Insurance Program was created. A lot of good things came from bipartisan cooperation. And Donna, you've referenced this earlier as well. The questioner asks, how do we get back to that from the very hyper-partisan environment that we have now? Is it possible to get back to where parties really are more consistently reaching across the aisle? More of that goes on than the American people suspect already, but not enough. I think everybody would agree. So, Donna, I'm going to start with you, and then Newt will give you the last word on that.
All right.
And of course, I'm probably in the minority in this view, but I still believe the missing ingredient in American politics today is having leaders who are willing to cross over to not see the other party as the enemy, but to see it as the opposition bringing in their ideas, and we're the opposition bringing in our ideas. You know, I just hope that we can sort of close this leadership gap, not just in American politics, but across all of our sectors. I mean, if you look at the polls today, and I do follow the polls as well, as I mentioned, but young people have lost faith in our system. They've lost faith in capitalism. They've lost faith in many of our public sector institutions as well as our private sector institutions. What are we going to do when the largest generation of Americans have lost faith in the country? And so we need to provide, especially because I think public service is one of the highest forms of visible leadership in the country. We need to provide more examples that we can find the common good. And again, I'm not Pollyannish. I mean, I know you got to negotiate. I know negotiation is hard work, but you have to have relationships. When I tell people that I'm proud that when my dad died, George W. Bush sent me a handwritten note. A handwritten note. That meant so much. I still have it. I show it to my students at Georgetown and Howard. I said, I have in my basement a big old poster signed by Ronald Reagan and Coretta Scott King making Martin Luther King's birthday a holiday. I got a letter from George W. Bush. And when I went to, and I'll stop right now, when I went to the funeral of Governor Kathleen Balbino Blanco last year, and she tragically died from cancer. And there I was in the church down there in Lafayette, Louisiana, and right there in a book, George W. Bush, he had sent the letter. I mean, we can still get our work done. We can still argue. We can still disagree, but we have to respect that part of this system of government, part of our value system is that we can also try to find common ground and work together. So I'll leave it at that. And let me tell you, for the rest of my life, we'll disagree. We might not be on the same hour with Fox News. But when he writes something, When Speaker Gingrich put his name to it, it's worthy to read it because I know he understands politics and I respect him. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, for being a good, not just a good friend, but also thank you for being a kind and gracious soul for many of us who learn from your leadership when you serve as Speaker of the House. So thank you.
Well,
So Newt,
that's very nice, and I'm not quite sure how to follow up on that. I think part of it, and this goes back to in the 90s. I think Donna would agree with me that Clinton and I were able, while we're both tough partisans, we both had this strange sense that we served the country, and that serving the country was actually more important than serving our parties. And that the only way you could actually get something done under our system was to have the president sign what we passed. So we couldn't pass something he wouldn't sign or it wouldn't become law. And he couldn't refuse to sign anything we passed or it wouldn't become law. So you really had to negotiate. We calculated one time that we spent 35 days in the cabinet room with the president, negotiating the balance. The only 4 balanced budgets of your lifetime, Clinton and I negotiated. And it was personal. I mean, we were there looking at stuff, asking questions, and you couldn't do it at any level below that. I think it requires, and this is one of my failures. When Trump was first elected, I did everything I could to get them to skip the fight over Obamacare and go to an infrastructure bill. And this is what I'll say to him about next year. An infrastructure bill, by definition, has the potential to be bipartisan. It has the potential to get people talking with each other who otherwise won't. And you've got to start a conversation. You can't leap ahead to a conclusion if you don't have a beginning. And they never had a beginning. And I think it's very important. It'll be interesting to see if Biden can do it without blowing up his left wing, because he at least claims he'd like to reach out and be bipartisan. My strongest advice to the president, if he gets reelected, is going to be to spend a substantial amount of time and energy in the first 90 days, reaching out to a lot of individual Democrats, not allowing himself to get trapped by Nancy, because that guarantees that it's totally partisan. But instead to go around and say to people, what do you need for your district? If we're going to do an infrastructure bill, what would really matter back home? What would create jobs? If he'll do that, they'll be at the beginning of a conversation from which you can really begin to have a bipartisan approach, and you can begin to talk again beyond partisanship.
That would be great advice.
We have covered an extraordinary amount of ground in this last hour and a half, from obviously the election, racial tensions in America, the pandemic, now ending on infrastructure. But I want to go back to a phrase that you used, Newt, which was, it's about the politics of people. I think for the last hour and a half, we have seen that amply demonstrated. It's about the politics of people, and it's about the people who really can use and wield the politics for the benefit of our country and our society. And we couldn't find 2 better exponents of that than the people we've just been listening to for the last hour and a half, Donna Brazile and Newt Gingrich. I want to thank both of you for really fascinating and I'll turn things over now, I believe, to Ryan to close this meeting. But thank you both very, very much.
Great, thank you, Susan. Yes, and Donna, thank you for sharing your time and your thoughts with us here today. And audience, thank you for hanging in there. We know we went a little long, but I think the conversation was worth it. And we ask and invite you to join us for our next session in this series, which is Thursday, November 12th, a post-election look at healthcare with the advisory board's Ford Coles. Thanks, everyone, and I'll turn it back to Amy to wrap us up.
All right, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Newt, Donna, and Susan for a great discussion today. For our attendees, if you met all CPE certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download. A copy will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. And here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us again next time.